I invite you to join me in a prayer. Let us pray. Creator God, what an amazing world you have made. From the waters of the sea and the firmness of the ground below to the clouds and the sun above. From the lights of the stars above to the light you put within each of us. Wow, well done, God. We are here tonight to praise you for your creative power, the depths of which we've barely even begun to understand. We're also here because you declared everything good at the beginning, but it's now apparent that humanity has turned against that goodness. We don't have all the answers, Lord, and that's why we're here. We're here to learn. We're here to care more. Teach us, Lord, what you would have us to learn. Inspire us to follow your call in these times, and embolden us to act as a people of hope, to be the kind of compassionate and passionate caretakers of your world and your people that you call us to be. Bless the speakers and each one of us as we form a worshiping and learning community together over the next 5 weeks. We ask all of this in Jesus' name, our teacher and Lord. Amen.
Right before we hand back to Doug to lead us into our meeting, I have been reminded that we just started recording. We're hoping to use these sessions as a resource to be shared, at least on our District website here for the Southern Ohio Kentucky District of the Church of the Brethren, but I'm sure would be available to others who perhaps missed this meeting or to any of you who want to review it. For the most part, as we're recording, unless you've been pinned or spotlighted, your video is probably not recording. If you would strongly prefer not to have your video used, just let us know. We'll make sure to edit any of that out before making it available online. But for the most part, your video would not likely be showing up anyway. So just wanted to let you know that's why we're recording. If you see that red dot, we are sharing in that way. So Doug, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Caleb and the Heischmans and Barb. I'm happy to introduce to you Byron Smith, ecological ethicist and Christian minister with a doctorate focused on emotional responses to climate change. He splits his time in pastoral ministry at St. George's Anglican Church, Paddington, in Sydney, Australia, New South Wales, and a speaking and writing ministry helping churches connect climate justice and faith. He enjoys making soil and honey, or at least watching worms and bees do that. And we have him here in particular because he has done some work on making connections between COVID-19 and climate change. And so I invite you now, Byron, to lead us.
Thanks, Doug. And g'day, Earthlings. Byron here on Gadigal land, stolen land, land never ceded. As Doug said, I'm on the east coast of the lands now called Australia. This place and all your respective places near and far are each loved by our gracious Creator and have been cared for and home to various First Peoples since time immemorial, as we have each been acknowledging. And so I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I pray that the places where we each live may become and remain a home for us all and for all God's creatures, as we walk in humility and repentance towards friendship with the land's original custodians. Behind me is an image of Gomeroi land, a beautiful forest that might serve as a reminder of one small slice of what we're all seeking to protect on God's beautiful earth. It's a place very special and dear to my heart. Thank you to those who've organised this event and to Doug for the invitation to be here. It's a privilege to share this space. Now, let me state the obvious. We're meeting online because of a global pandemic. You've all heard the stats: 39 million confirmed infections, 1.1 million confirmed deaths, both likely significant underestimates. Millions more who may suffer lifelong health impacts even after recovery. We live in tumultuous times. And yet we're meeting to talk about something other than COVID-19 and the disruptions to communities, economies, and politics that it's brought. Perhaps to some of us, that's almost a relief, a chance to shift focus. To others, maybe there's a hunch that it's premature or a distraction from the urgent need of the moment. But for the moment, we're going to address this elephant in the room, because if we want to wrestle with the climate crisis, we need to do so from the place in which we find ourselves, which right now means amidst a global pandemic. So let's spend a few moments discussing these matters, and I want to introduce a triple parallel for you. So here's the first part. Some problems sneak up on us. The first signs may be so insignificant that they're barely noticeable to a casual observer, but unchallenged growth is deadly far sooner than we think. The warning signs were there. One morning in my late 20s, I woke up without a voice. "That's weird," I whispered to my wife. "Probably coming down with a cold or something." Days passed without improvement or any sign of infection. I put it down to stress. Assessment deadlines were piling up in my last year of a degree course, and we'd just suffered a significant family tragedy. Soon after, I started needing to make tiny, silent burps all the time. And then a flight of stairs would leave me puffed. And when I mentioned these things to friends, in the hoarse whisper I'd been getting used to, they all suggested seeing a doctor. But life was busy, exams were closing in, I'd do something about it later. Weeks passed me by. I passed final exams. By then, even a short walk left me breathless. And one night I coughed up blood, a lot, bright red. And that overcame my inertia. A GP visit led to a specialist appointment, then to a scan. And within days, I was diagnosed with a malignant tumor invading my trachea and esophagus, rapidly growing. By the time I started treatment soon after, I could barely breathe. Warning signs had been there, but I hadn't gone straight to the experts to understand because I didn't want my life disrupted. And when I did, the doctors told me things I couldn't have discovered on my own and recommended urgent, radical treatment. In my youthful presumption, I'd been neglecting troubling indicators. What I hadn't faced till almost too late was that there was, in fact, no business as usual option available to me. Life couldn't just go on as it had been. I could accept the radical treatment specified by qualified experts with the discomfort, disruption, and disability it brought, or I could walk into the even more radical, likely fatal, consequences of refusing such treatment. That's our first parallel. The second, again, the warning signs were there. Back last December, a new infection was spreading in China. By January, international medical bodies started sounding the alarms. In February, horrifying stories escaped Wuhan. Hospitals overwhelmed, doctors and nurses joining their patients in the morgue. Daily life shut down, fear spreading through the population almost as fast as the virus. Yet too many governments sat on their hands, squandering precious weeks of potential preparation and suppression, neglecting public education, and losing the possibility of containment, let alone eradication. Misinformation flourished, contradictory messages were sent, and the curve started climbing. Experts spoke of imminent dangers most of us wouldn't recognize on our own. They had spent years documenting the collective failure of most nations around the world to prepare for the next pandemic. They had issued warnings of severe risks and global peril, called for investments in research, for national plans for strategic stockpiles. Other researchers had highlighted the ways that our system of industrial agriculture and our willingness to sacrifice the integrity of ecosystems in pursuit of profit multiplied the likelihood of novel diseases jumping to us humans from those dwindling populations of wild animals we were leaving less and less space to breathe. But all these warnings had been filed into the too hard basket by governments committed to maximisation of GDP and to scoring political points, and by corporations with their eye on quarterly shareholder returns. Cans were kicked down roads, preparations were neglected, risk accrued unacknowledged. The pandemic caught us underprepared for a predictable and predicted threat. By March, the disease was growing so obvious that it couldn't be ignored or dismissed with mere platitudes. Most governments sprang into action, some more responsibly than others. Having finally started paying attention, they were now scrambling to make up for lost time, conscious of the lack of a status quo option. Life could no longer just go on as before. We either had to embrace radical limits on our usual freedoms to move and gather with the social, economic, and political disruption they have brought, or we would have collectively walked into the even more radical consequences of an unmitigated pandemic, consequences partially visible in those nations whose leadership continues to downplay the virus and which have not escaped its economic and social consequences despite refusing to implement the urgings of public health experts. The third parallel. The warning signs have been with us for some time. Charred forests, whitened coral, retreating glaciers, rising tides, intensifying heat waves, hurricanes, and humidity. Experts have been sounding the alarm for decades, pointing to rising levels of heat-trapping gases, warming oceans, an expanding troposphere, the gradual poleward migration of species, both marine and terrestrial. This constellation of symptoms decisively indicates a massive human disruption of the global climate system. Scientists have spent decades documenting the increasingly dire and widespread impacts of such disruption on temperature and precipitation patterns, on ecosystems already stressed by myriad human demands, on people and societies around the globe, with the greatest burden falling disproportionately on those already most vulnerable. Failed crops, altered disease vectors, the degradation of coastal infrastructure, all these and more tell a story of worsening woe. But our current symptoms are just a tiny taste of what the models suggest is soon to come. The curve steepens before us. Experts have issued warnings of severe risks and global peril, called for rapid shifts in how we power, feed, move, shelter, arrange, and amuse ourselves. Governments have dithered and bickered, postponing many hard decisions to further down the track. Vested interests have covertly funded misinformation, sowing confusion and generating a tiresome and repetitive pseudo-debate, successfully polarizing public opinion by partisan allegiance. Political paralysis keeps open the window during which the few can profit from sending the future of the many up in smoke. Like my cancer, like COVID-19, the longer we ignore this, the worse it gets. And the rate at which harms occur accelerates. If we listen to experts, we can see disaster looming. We know that the sooner we act, the smaller our losses. Yet the lure of wanting things to return to normal after the pandemic is strong. We must remember that normal means continuing to careen into climate catastrophe. Normal is already a catastrophe for too many. If such normality is re-established, it will not last. Calling something unsustainable doesn't mean it will make polar bears cry or Greta Thunberg scowl. It means it cannot, and so will not, be sustained. Life will not just go on as before. We either radically alter our priorities, putting the needs of the many before the desires of the few, with the disruption to our dominant stories and systems this requires, or we will increasingly find ourselves plunging into the even more radical consequences of altering the basic parameters of planetary life, rendering Earth unrecognizable and increasingly uninhabitable. So I've been drawing parallels between these three examples: cancer, COVID-19, and climate disruption. All involve exponential growth where the problems keep getting worse at an accelerating rate. All begin more or less invisible to the casual observer, only being detectable through specialist knowledge and technology. By the time they each become obvious, it may be too late to avoid significant disruption and destruction. So one simple lesson here concerns our willingness to heed relevant expertise. When it comes to the church's willingness to listen, it's more than possible to point fingers at particular Christian subcultures that embrace anti-scientific or even anti-intellectual theological assumptions. We've all heard the stories of churches that have peddled supposed miracle cures for COVID-19, or churches that continued to meet long after it was prudent or loving to do so. And in the process, these churches helped to spread death and disease through gatherings claiming to worship the word of life. We're also all likely aware of the fact that climate denial has taken deep root among certain branches of the church, a fact I barely need to spell out in my own context, or likely in yours. Pointing fingers at others in the church for embracing outright climate denial is easy. Finding constructive ways of engaging with denial in our own congregations is much trickier. But hardest of all is facing the hidden denial in each of our own hearts. Because the truth is that we don't want to face bad news that threatens our sense of self, of stability, of meaning. And climate disruption does all this and more. While we here might accept the findings of climate experts and even be doing all kinds of things to respond appropriately and urge others to do so, nonetheless, most of us continue to live with various forms of denial. The truth of our planetary predicament is very hard to swallow. I believe you'll be exploring this in more detail over the coming days and weeks. How do we, as followers of Jesus, and many of us leaders of various kinds, how do we live in climate truth? How do we not just accept the scientific findings of climatologists, but internalize them, allow them to thoroughly shape our perceptions of who we are and the priorities of faith, hope, and love in our historical moment? These are not easy questions. We're all beginners facing historically novel challenges on a rapidly changing planet amidst a complex global society. But if we're going to love our neighbour during a pandemic, we need to listen to epidemiologists and virologists. We don't need to know everything, but there's a certain minimum knowledge we do need. And if we're going to love our neighbour and honour our creator on a warming world, we're going to need to grasp and digest the basics of climate science. Is it happening? Yes. Is it us? Yes. Is it bad? Yes. Can we do anything? Yes. And then get a sense of what we can actually do, personally, perhaps especially collectively. Just as we can't suppress a global pandemic without coordinated action, so climate action requires massive cooperation as well. As Bill McKibben likes to say, the most important thing we can each do as individuals is to not be individuals. If heating experts is one lesson of noting the parallels between cancer, COVID, and climate, another is the importance of urgency. These challenges rapidly get worse. Waiting an extra week or two before implementing lockdown can result in contagion spreading 5 or 10 times as far as a scenario in which immediate action was taken. If I'd waited just another few weeks before seeking treatment, I might not have made it. And with climate, the longer we wait, the worse things are going to get. Though crucially, the timescales involved are very different. SARS-CoV-2, the virus behind the COVID-19 pandemic, was unknown until last December. Its arrival, description, and disruption have played out in a matter of months. It gets headlines because it moves quickly. In contrast, climate disruption builds over decades, even centuries, with a wide variety of dangers exhibited progressively and cumulatively over time. People often misunderstand the nature of this timeframe challenge. It was common a year or two ago to hear people speak about having 12 or 11 years to solve the climate crisis. Or going back a few years, the Guardian newspaper ran a series of articles under the heading 100 months to save the world. But climate disruption doesn't work like this. There's not a window within which we can solve it safely, after which efforts become futile. It's not like cancer, where the outcome is basically binary, survival or death. For climate, the window of action is always open, but the costs of delay keep mounting, the harms keep accruing, the sunk economic costs of dirty energy infrastructure keep rising, the locked-in warming keeps growing. We are always in the window of possibility for avoiding certain harms, but the scale and severity of those harms gets bigger. To put this another way, there's much discussion of whether we are too late, whether climate disruption is already baked in. And to that, the answer is a resounding yes. We are too late to prevent the Great Barrier Reef from devastating bleaching, too late to save the houses of many poor people in Bangladesh, too late to avoid catastrophic bushfires during our recent Black Summer here in Eastern Australia, or your own wildfires on the western side of your continent. Harms are already visible. If we wanted to avoid them, we needed to start in earnest at least a few decades ago, and more harms are already in the pipeline. We can no longer avoid the devastating heat waves and floods and droughts of the next few years. The thermal lag in the oceans means that even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, we'd still see warming for some years. But crucially, we're not too late to avoid the worst outcomes, to shift our path from catastrophe to merely disaster. We're not too late to preserve precious fragments of the living world and to retain a measure of habitability. The slower and smaller we can make the warming, the more space will remain on Earth for human and more than human life to flourish. And yet, in my country and yours, dirty energy continues to pay for dirty politics. I won't attempt to lecture you about the various failures of your political system, because those in my own nation are enough for me to focus on. The truth is that both our nations have played massively oversized and generally disruptive roles when it comes to seeking global agreement on minimizing climate disruption, or when it comes to cutting our own massive contributions to the problem. Both our nations have outsized fossil fuel industries polluting public discourse, funding misinformation, buying candidates, and generally thwarting the common good through the pursuit of their dirty profits. The COVID pandemic, a genuine global crisis that I don't in any way want to minimize or dismiss, has nonetheless functioned here in Australia and on your side of the Pacific to distract us from an even greater global crisis and our role in worsening it. So perhaps the biggest lesson for climate from the COVID pandemic is that we have never treated climate as a crisis. But we've now seen a new degree of transformative social, economic, and policy change achieved almost overnight, when the political will is present to heed the warnings of experts and pursue responses commensurate with the scale of the threat, at least in some nations. That is a lesson we mustn't forget. Change can happen much faster than we think, for good and ill. And when it comes to our collective climate policies, our choices today will have consequences for centuries. Will we leave this place better than we found it for those who come after? Or will we leave a depleted and degraded world, far less hospitable to human and more than human life, on which the capacity for shared flourishing is greatly diminished? Love refuses to walk down that path. Romans 13:10 says, love does no harm to a neighbour. If we are participating in systems that are grievously wounding our neighbours, making it harder for them to breathe clean air, drink clean water, eat nutritious food, have stable shelter, avoid damaging extremes, if we are binding ourselves to such systems, then we are participating in loveless harm. Some of these systems need to be dismantled, and replaced out of love and with great speed. Whatever we do, we are invited by the risen Christ to a true and living way, to live up to our created mandate to represent the generous and hospitable rule of God. We live in the love of Christ, who gave himself up for us, and our lives can offer a sign of hope to a desperate world that God has not abandoned us or sentenced the planet to destruction, but waits and longs and will act to renew all things. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Byron, for that stirring and vivid talk. And we have about 5 minutes if anyone would like to ask specific questions of Byron. And again, just use chat, or it's fine if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question. So Mark, you're raising your hand?
Yep, I am.
Go ahead.
I'd be interested to hear, Byron, the kind of leadership that denominations or religious leaders in Australia are providing as individuals and churches in the country tries to grapple with the impact of climate change. Is there some recognized leadership that actually is being listened to? And are they taking on the leadership role?
Thank you. Great question. The answer is it's far thinner on the ground than I would hope. Certainly in my own diocese, my own denomination here in Sydney, and in the other largest denomination in Australia, which is the Catholic Church, the response has been patchy at best. There are some parts of the church doing much better. We have one denomination called the Uniting Church, which is a merger a few decades old between Congregational, Presbyterian, and Methodist denominations, and they have been much more forward-looking. Though even there, the changes still feel early on. So individual churches shifting their practices, putting up solar panels, some lobbying of government. It really is the case that culturally on this topic, Australia has followed in the footsteps of the US in many ways. Much of the same misinformation campaign. Fossil fuels play a massive role in Australian politics. We're the largest exporters of coal in the world, the largest exporters of liquid natural gas. And that has really shaped the priorities of our discourse. We too have a media landscape dominated by Rupert Murdoch, one of the exports from our country to yours. And so within that context, the response from church leaders, sadly, has largely been lagging. There are some organizations, extra parachurch organizations doing a much better job. So I'm part of a group called Common Grace, which is a movement for Jesus and justice with tens of thousands of members. And that has a whole branch dedicated to climate and creation justice, and has been seeking to weave that much more into the life of the church, and seeking to help those in the church with this on their heart, to lobby members of parliament, and to build support in their local communities, and to work with other parts of the climate movement on that.
All right, we have time for one more question, and Andrew Hudson has raised his hand.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, for a call to action of the church. And I appreciated a sort of gentle critique of how we approach the information. And one thing I think I heard you address is that we don't bring a lot of theological language, that we're still struggling, I think, maybe to articulate what is the gospel, and how does it apply very directly to climate change. So my most pointed question is, what is the good news for this time? But if if you have thoughts on like nuggets of theological language that can most directly bear on this, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, great question. This is worth a whole conference in itself. And there is a whole and growing branch of theology, eco-theology, that's attempting to develop this language and has been for some decades. I'm trying to pick a few points out of it. The good news is that we, as creatures of a gracious and wise creator, were created to live as members of the community of creation, but we have abandoned that calling and sought to worship parts of the creation and serve ourselves rather than honoring the creator and serving our neighbors. And Jesus forges for us a true and living way in which we can truly become ourselves as communities of faith that are built around a story of love and faith and hope, rather than communities built around the love of money and the accumulation of possessions and the accumulation of power. And so the good news is that human and more than human life can and does flourish in a humble dependence upon the Creator. But it can and is diminishing when it places idols and itself in the place of the Creator. There's much more that can be said. This is a huge topic, but I think we all need to keep on finding more language. I really appreciated that worship segment that we shared earlier. And increasingly resources are being developed by many organizations and churches for the collective expression of our faith in the context of a warming world.
Thank you, Byron. Thank you for sharing with us. And I don't know if you're welcome to stay. It'd be great to have you. I'm going to move us now into Byron talked a little bit about the hidden denial that is in with many of us, and I want to develop that a little bit further for the rest of our teaching time. And first, just want to introduce myself briefly as well. I am the Director of Pastoral Ecology at the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, who is sponsoring this with the Ohio and Southern Ohio, Kentucky District of the Church of the Brethren. We're a collaboration of Goshen College, Eastern Mennonite University, and Mennonite Central Committee. And I have led 6 pastoral retreats now, and here are 3 recent ones, one in California, another one in Oregon, and another one in New York. And they've been remarkable times meeting with pastors and other leaders mostly in the Mennonite church, but a few others as well. And it's great to be here with brethren. My interest in ecological ministry started about 17 years ago because we baptized people in our local river, which has too much manure at times. This got me thinking about what it means to worship God as creator and to read the Bible differently. And it also has got me involved with Hoosier River Watch, which trained me and others to test the water for E. coli bacteria. So as we think about climate change and about the hidden denial within us, I thought we would start with a poll. And so I think, do I need to stop share to do that, Caleb? About how often do you talk about climate change, daily, weekly, monthly, or less? And why do you think that is so? So if you want to quick answer this question. And I just would invite, if one of you wants, a couple of you want to comment on why you said what you said. It actually looks like we're a fairly talkative group about it. No one said less than once a month. many of us weekly, a few of us even daily. And I think because of time, I will just keep moving along here. So that's, yeah, those are actually good numbers. There's a kind of psychological paradox when it comes to climate change, which is that over the past decades, as the science has become more convincing, people became less concerned about it. And this was not just something in North America. This was what occurred in many developed countries. Either they didn't believe the science or didn't act upon it. This declining interest in climate change actually reversed in about 2016. At the end of last year, 72% of Americans said that climate change was important to them personally. There's been a slight decline after the coronavirus. But as a public policy issue, climate change has lagged a bit. Last year, climate change was near the bottom of the 20-some public policy issues that people wanted the federal government to be focused on. This is from a Pew Research Center survey every January. But it made a dramatic jump this past year, after the year of climate anxiety, as it was called here in the US, to the middle, but it is still in the middle. And this graphic also shows the political polarization on the issue. Climate change with Democrats in blue and Republicans in red, and climate change is the most polarized of any of the issues here, more polarized than gun policy, more polarized than immigration. Although it's important to notice this is talking about what the federal government should be focused on. A majority of both Democrats and Republicans agree on certain things about climate change, like increased research on renewable energy, regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And another more recent measure by the Yale Program on Climate Communication is that 1/4 of Americans are now alarmed about climate change and see it as a serious threat, while only 7% dismiss the climate crisis. That means that 4 times as many Americans are alarmed than are dismissive. And just 5 years ago, these two groups were the same. So there's no question that this is changing, and that remarkably, in both debates so far, there has been a question about climate change. And that's the first time that in a presidential or vice presidential debate, there's been a question about climate change. So it seems that we are moving a bit beyond the denial of the past. When we think of denial, we usually think here in the US of the Republican Party or of conservatives, where some dismiss the scientific consensus that human activity is increasing carbon dioxide and methane, causing global temperatures to rise. And as I mentioned, this actually is not a large group of people, but their voice tends to be amplified. But this is not the only kind of denial, not the only problem we have denial. During a year in Norway, American sociologist Kari Norgaard found a more pervasive denial among those who accepted the scientific consensus. Like outright denial, this denial protects people from troubling emotions surrounding climate change, but unlike outright denial, it's more subtle and difficult to discern. She spent a year in a small town in Norway, the warmest winter in 130 years, and she noticed that the townspeople managed to avoid talking about climate change. They weren't literal deniers who think the science is made up. They simply didn't want to talk about it. And this is the case even though Norwegians are dependent on winter. Both winter and wilderness are closely bound to their national identity. They see themselves as environmental and social justice people in the world, but they're also a wealthy country, and much of that wealth comes from their oil reserves in the Northern Sea. And so this very contradiction of their environmental identity, and while immensely benefiting from environmental devastation, is what causes the need for this denial. Sociologist Stanley Cohen first developed the idea of these more subtle forms of denial in his out of his context in South Africa. And he asked himself, why did he not notice that something was wrong with apartheid. Only over time and with consciousness raising did he notice the injustice of the apartheid system. And then he had to wonder, how was it that others did not see what he saw and did not see the injustice? How could the horrors of apartheid remain invisible to them? And so he sees denial as a way of looking innocent by not noticing troubling information. And denial is something that is helpful for perpetrators so that they can live with themselves. But even victims who don't want to see themselves as victims find it helpful, as do bystanders who can't intervene in all situations and so find ways to avoid needing to engage on an issue. And Cohen identifies 3 types of denial that Norgaard applied to climate change: literal denial, interpretive, and implicatory. And so literal denial is what we usually think of when we're talking about climate denial. It's factual or blatant denial. The fact itself is denied. It would be claiming that the Holocaust never happened. US President Donald Trump was a literal denier of climate change when he tweeted back in 2012, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. In the second type of denial, interpretive, the facts are not denied, but they're given a different interpretation than what would be most apparent to others. A person might say, well, I'm a social drinker, not an alcoholic. It's not that nothing happened, it's just that what you think happened is not what really happened. It would be saying that climate is not a serious threat, that technology will save us. And a number of conservatives are moving in that direction. In implicatory denial, the information or facts are not denied, nor are they given an unconventional interpretation. Rather, what is minimized or denied are the psychological, political, and moral implications. In this case, we might see a mugging happen, but we don't intervene, we rationalize. The reality is acknowledged, but its significance or implications are denied. And this is, I think, the most prevalent kind of denial with climate change, not rejecting the facts, but a failure to integrate this knowledge into everyday life or transform it into political action. Denial protects us from a number of troubling emotions that are connected to climate change. I've listed a number here, partly because I find it sometimes it's difficult for us to talk about our emotions. And so there's helplessness is a very obvious kind of emotion connected to climate change. It's such a huge problem. It's hard to know what we can do as individuals about it. Guilt about how our lifestyle is destroying the planet, and yet it feels, again, like there's little we can do about it. Grief, as we feel that we're experiencing losses in our changing world. I've also, though, included some positive emotions we may connect with climate change. Emotions that would support policies to address climate change, and denial keeps us from getting to these emotions too. Working at climate change gives us a sense of purpose, personal efficacy, that I can make a difference, helps us to engage and to be involved. Ben Brapson, a climate scientist at Indiana University, has worked with Mennonites, and I think this applies to Brethren as well, and says that we believe that what we do matters. This is a part of our Anabaptist faith. Worry is not technically a positive emotion, but whereas fear and anxiety tend to cut off good thinking, worry can help us think through and solve problems. So I just would invite you to look at these emotions and to think of which ones you most identify with. And here I say share with a partner. We don't really have time for that, I don't think. We've been running about 5 minutes behind. I think, though, if 1 or 2 people just want to say something about your which of these you most identify with as you think about climate change, I'll just give a few minutes for us to do that.
I guess I should just
Put up a hand.
Yeah, somebody.
Yes.
Go
ahead.
Okay.
Sue, go first.
Yeah. I know there's a way to put a little hand somewhere, but I don't know how to do that. And I have a real little hand. So on the emotions, I have them all, 100% all of them. on the left side. And you asked us not how much we think about climate change, but how much we talk about it. And I only talk about it once a week because there isn't anybody in the world who would want to hear me talk about it as much as I would. So I kind of hold it in. But if anytime there is a segment on the news about nature or climate change or any of those things, I have to literally get up and leave the room because I just emotionally can't stand it. I guess on the right side, if you mean by personal efficacy, like doing something, I'm doing things that I can do, but I still feel despair because my little things from one person doesn't seem like much, and it's not going to make the change that the world needs.
Yeah, yeah.
We've got some comments in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say some are using chat, and that's a great idea.
So Brenda similarly says she feels helplessness over lack of personal efficacy. Even though this is a focus for her life, she wants to see legislation where real change can happen. Understandable feelings. Byron Smith similarly says grief and anger are main ones that he feels.
And I would say that helplessness, guilt, and purpose on the positive side are the ones that I feel. I've being part of the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions has just been an excellent way to feel a sense of purpose and giving meaning to my life, and yet it also means facing grief a lot. Well, I want to end my time with the saying a little bit about the faith responses that I think we as congregations, as we as people of faith, have available to us as we think about how to work with climate denial. We have this aspect of that being part of a congregation means we're part of a larger community where we can have carbon conversations is actually a very specific kind of thing that I can share resources on that if you're interested. But it's a place where we can have it be talked about, where we can pray about it, where we can bring it to a class, where our green group can discuss it. I also think we need to work at having rituals that engage grief, that allow us to face our destructive ways. As churches, we have lots of rituals around grief that are connected to death of people. And I think we need to work at how to engage disenfranchised griefs like miscarriage, like divorce, or the breakup of a relationship, moving those towards acknowledged. And what we might call ecological grief is another one of these disenfranchised griefs. And I think it's important for the church to find ways to work at that. And then also something that I call bifocal vision. This comes from Panu Pikula, who uses a different word, where we keep our eyes on two things at the same time. There's bad news around climate change, but there's also the good news of the opportunities that we have for better lives. And as Christians, again, we have resources in this area. We think about life and cross, resurrection, new life. So we're able to work at things in a bifocal way. And then finally, climate justice advocacy, where churches can become hubs for climate advocacy through Interfaith Power and Light here in the US and through other ways. I think that's my end there, and I haven't been able to follow the chat. Is there anything there that I need to know, Caleb?
A common thread is that people are saying we feel more of the emotions on the right when we're able to get together with others who can lead us.
Yeah.
I named that I have a lot of the implicatory denial, or from the videos you shared with us, the disavowal that she was talking about. But being with a group that makes a difference helps me move into those right side emotions.
Yeah, and so we are going to move into our reflection time, although I do want to give a moment in case anyone wants to ask a question about anything that I've said.
Doug,
Yes.
it's Mark. One of the things that I think we have been hoping that these times together that we have will produce is an opportunity within the district to create a bigger conversation. There are people within our Church of the Brethren district who think this is all hogwash or worse. That it's a form of evil that we would even consider having these conversations. But I think that deep down inside, we all know something is not right. And we need to move in a new direction. Don't always know what that is. And so, the hope is that both within the district and perhaps within the denomination, we can begin a process of conversation among people who, not just those who feel the same way that we do, but people who disagree with us, to really begin to say, okay, what are the things that we think we know together are happening that are not really very healthy related to climate change and the environment? And are there any places of common ground? So my hope is that we can create a model with the conversations that we're having about how we embrace the gifts that God has given us and how we take that in a positive direction as a people of Christian faith.
Yeah, and I would just emphasize you talking about conversation. I think that's one of the most critical things for us to be doing. That's part of why I asked that question. That is one of the findings. Sociologically, the more we are talking about this in a variety of settings, talking about it at a personal level. So I would encourage Sue to find people that she can talk to about it. It's true that it needs to be in appropriate ways or ways that doesn't alienate people, but I continue to be surprised at how interested people are in hearing my perspective on it, and that there isn't as much defense as what you might expect. We do want to move now to this a little bit of reflection on your own context. There's the document that I shared with you, a ministry plan, I called it, and there's a link in the chat to a Google Docs version of that. Ministry plan maybe is a little too fancy of an idea, but we're looking at that first question in this document. And let's see where, as you look within your community or the people around you, your congregation, how do you see denial at work, implicatory, interpretive, literal? What are some of your own emotions around climate change, and what do you see as effective ways you might engage people in these different forms of denial? And what we'll do is we'll give you a couple minutes here just for some personal reflection or writing if you want, and then Caleb will put us in breakout rooms where we can each talk for 5 minutes about our thoughts on this. So let's take, maybe we should go with 4 minutes for each thing. 4 minutes here for personal reflection.